Not a roar, not a trumpet, not even a war cry, just the sound of oars cutting rhythmically through the cold North Sea. No one knew what was coming. Not the monks, bent in early morning prayer. Not the kings of Europe, cloistered in their courts. And certainly not the simple folk who lived by the sea, who gazed out at the horizon and saw nothing but endless gray. But in the year 793, that whisper became a scream. What happened at Lindisfarne was not merely a raid. It was a turning point, a thunderclap marking the dawn of a new age. The Viking Age. This is not just the story of a monastery set aflame. It is the story of how an entire continent was shaken to its core, how ships became swords, how gods clashed across oceans, and how the echoes of one bloody morning still shape the world we know. So, tighten your grip on the past, because we're about to sail into a storm. Lindisfarne, a beacon of light before the darkness, before the smoke, before the slaughter, there was peace. Lindisfarne, a tidal island off the northeast coast of what we now call England, was a sanctuary. Founded in 635 AD by Saint Aidan, it was a center of learning, faith, and artistry. The monks who lived there were not warriors, they were scribes. Guardians of illuminated manuscripts, keepers of relics, men devoted to quiet prayer and the rhythms of monastic life. The Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterwork of calligraphy and devotion, were born here. The island was a jewel of Northumbrian Christianity, famed throughout Christendom. But jewels attract thieves, and the tides, once allies to the monks, would soon betray them. The Northmen, who were the Vikings, and the lands across the sea, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, a different rhythm ruled. Harsh winters, short summers, tribes, not kingdoms, chieftains, not emperors. The men we call Vikings didn't think of themselves as a united people. They were farmers, craftsmen, sailors, and sometimes raiders. They came from villages nestled in fjords, where survival demanded toughness and fortune favored the bold. But why leave home at all? Climate change, population pressures, political upheaval, perhaps all of these. But more than that, opportunity. The Christian monasteries of the British Isles were wealthy, poorly defended, and ripe for the taking. To the Norse, these were not holy places. They were banks, soft targets waiting for the strong, and they had the perfect tool to reach them. The longship, engineering the age of invasion. The Viking longship wasn't just a vessel. It was a revolution. Sleek, symmetrical, built for speed and stealth. These ships could cross open oceans yet sail up rivers, beach on coasts, and vanish into the mist. With a shallow draft and overlapping planks sealed with animal hair and tar, they were light enough to carry yet strong enough to conquer. Each one could hold dozens of warriors and their gear. The carved dragon heads on the prow were not just decoration, they were terror given form. To see such a beast glide silently toward your shore was to see your world end. It was this blend of fear and function that made the longship the engine of the Viking Age. It took them where they wanted, when they wanted, and on one fateful day, it brought them to Lindisfarne. Portents and omens, the calm before the slaughter, there were signs. Always there are signs if one knows how to read them. In the months before the raid, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle speaks of ominous events, whirlwinds, lightning storms, fiery dragons seen in the sky. To the superstitious, these were warnings. To the devout, divine punishment for a sinful age. But to the monks of Lindisfarne, life continued as it always had, structured by prayer, study, and silence. June 8th, 793. A date few would forget. The monks awoke as they always did, to the chill of the sea breeze and the soft tolling of the chapel bell. They couldn't know it would be the last morning some of them would ever see. The sails came over the horizon like specters. The silence shattered. And then, fire. The forge in the sea, Norse technology and shipbuilding mastery. Before the world trembled at the word Viking, before the monasteries burned and kings prayed for deliverance, the Northmen were quietly mastering one thing that would change history forever: their ships. For it was not brute strength or overwhelming numbers that gave the Norsemen their edge. It was mobility. It was engineering. It was their ability to bring the sea to heel. The Viking longship was a marvel. Narrow, fast, and flexible. Designed with a shallow draft, it could slice through open seas or slip silently up rivers. Raiders could sail straight into a kingdom's heartland before their presence was even known. Crafted from oak, reinforced with iron nails, and powered by both sail and oar, these ships became the very symbol of the Viking Age. They were both weapon and steed, dragons of the sea with their prows carved like beasts from myth. But the ships alone didn't raid Lindisfarne. It was the men aboard. Warriors, smiths, explorers, and poets. Yes, even poets. The Norse did not yet call themselves Vikings. That term meant something closer to one who goes adventuring. And go adventuring they did. The raids seen through the eyes of the monks. Picture this, a brisk morning in June of 793. The salty wind from the North Sea nips at the robes of a sleepy monk as he steps outside to gather water from the well. He doesn't see them at first. Just the sound, the rhythmic splash of oars. Then, over the swell of the waves, he sees them. Black shapes against the dawn. Too fast for merchantmen. Too many for pilgrims. By the time the alarm is raised, it is too late. The monks of Lindisfarne had dedicated their lives to God. Many never thought they'd see violence in their sacred haven. They were scholars, scribes, and keepers of relics. Men who spent more time in prayer than in planning defense. They were utterly unprepared for the world that would come crashing ashore. The raiders were not indiscriminate but efficient. The abbey was looted of its gold, its chalices and crucifixes stripped from altars, manuscripts torn from shelves. Those monks who resisted were slaughtered. Others were taken, not as converts, as slaves. The shockwave. Europe reacts to the unthinkable. The news spread like wildfire. Lindisfarne had been desecrated. A holy island, violated by heathens from across the sea. For the Christian kingdoms of Europe, this was not just an attack, it was an omen. Letters flew across Christendom. Alcuin of York, a leading scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, wrote in disbelief. Is this the judgment of God? Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priest of God. Fear turned into fervor. For the first time, Europe began to see the North as something more than a distant land of snow and sagas. It was a threat wrapped in fur and iron, wielding axes and pagan chants. Monasteries along the coast of Ireland and Francia took heed. Fortifications were raised. Night prayers lengthened. The ringing of church bells now served dual purpose, to call the faithful and to warn of sails on the horizon. The gods of the North, faith versus faith. To the monks of Lindisfarne, the Northmen were agents of chaos, tools of Satan. But to the raiders themselves, they were children of a different divine order. Odin, Thor, Freya. Their gods did not demand meekness. They demanded bravery, strength, and conquest. The clash at Lindisfarne was not just one of steel. It was of spirit. Christianity preached turning the other cheek. Norse mythology told you to take vengeance with your axe. These weren't just cultural differences. They were entire worldviews colliding. To die in battle was to be honored in Valhalla. To fall with sword in hand was not damnation, it was exaltation. The captives, silent witnesses to a new age, some monks survived. Bound in ropes, gagged with cloth, they were thrown into the hulls of longships and taken across the sea. These were not prisoners of war. These were capital. Human currency to be sold in slave markets or bartered to chieftains. And yet, these captives would become something else. Chroniclers. Seeds of memory. Their testimony, preserved in trembling ink, would become the basis for how we remember Lindisfarne. Ironically, it was the very men the Vikings sought to silence who ensured their names would echo through history. Aftermath, the new normal, the raid on Lindisfarne did not end the world. But it changed it. Other monasteries followed. Jarrow, Iona, then cities, then kingdoms. The Northmen came not just to plunder, but to settle. They brought their families, built their own villages, married local women. In time, Viking blood ran through the veins of Ireland, Scotland, and England. Even Normandy, literally land of the Northmen, was born from Norse conquest. But it all started here. One morning, one island, one unholy raid. The warriors themselves, profiles from the past, though names were rarely recorded, archaeology gives us hints of who these early raiders were. One skeleton, found in a Norse burial site, was laid to rest with both Christian and pagan symbols, a warrior caught between two worlds. Were the raiders all bloodthirsty savages? Or were some of them explorers, testing the boundaries of what lay beyond? We must remember, history tends to be written by the victims or the victors. Perhaps the first raider at Lindisfarne was a fisherman turned fighter. Perhaps he wept as he watched monks beg for their lives, unsure whether he was fulfilling Odin's will or simply trying to survive a brutal age. A world forever changed. By 1066, the Viking Age would end in the fires of Stamford Bridge and the Norman conquest. But the echoes of Lindisfarne would carry on. In language, in bloodlines, in legend. We speak of Vikings today not just as warriors, but as part of the European fabric. Traders, settlers, innovators. Yet it all began with fire and blood on a small, sacred island off the English coast. Lindisfarne, the place where the old world ended and a new age began. If this story stirred something in you, if the clash of faith and fire, of sword and scripture, felt like the opening to a saga still being written, then stay with us. Like and subscribe. We'll follow the Longships wherever they go, through storm and silence, through myth and memory. History isn't dead. It simply waits to be rediscovered. We often picture the Vikings sailing west toward monasteries, England, the open sea. But many turned east, into the rivers, into the forests, into a world that would one day be called Russia. From the Baltic Sea, they slipped into the Neva River, then into Lake Ladoga, and further south through the Folkhof and the Dnieper. Waterways were their highways. Longships glided like phantoms. They weren't just raiding, they were trading, settling, intermarrying. These Norsemen, called Varangians, founded trading posts like Novgorod and Kiev, which would become the spine of a new civilization, the Kievan Rus. They brought swords, but they also brought order. They brokered furs, honey, and slaves for silk, spices, and silver from Byzantium. And in a twist of fate, the Viking who once terrified monasteries would one day serve as the emperor's bodyguard in Constantinople, the elite Varangian Guard. The East didn't just change because of the Vikings. The Vikings changed too. The hammer falls on France, the siege of Paris. Now let's turn west to a city that stood like a jewel upon the Seine, Paris. In 845, a Viking chieftain named Ragnar Lodbrok, yes, that Ragnar, sailed up the river with 120 ships and over 5,000 warriors. The Franks watched in disbelief. No one had dared this before. The siege was brutal. The city trembled. Churches were looted, people taken. The King Charles the Bald didn't fight, he paid them off. 7,000 pounds of silver. A fortune. A message. The gates to Western Europe were open, and the Norse knew it. After Paris, France became a revolving door of raids, settlements, and eventually treaties. In time, a Norseman named Rollo would be granted land by the French crown in exchange for peace. That land would be called Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The Vikings didn't just sack Paris. They planted roots in its soil. Into Iberia, the Viking clashed with Muslim Spain. Further south, the story takes a stranger turn. In 844, Norse ships appeared off the coast of Muslim-ruled Spain, then called Al-Andalus. The Caliphate had never seen anything like them. These weren't crusaders or imperial armies. They were something wilder, alien, dangerous. The Vikings raided Seville, pillaged it, held it for days. But this time, they were met with organized resistance. The Muslim forces struck back hard. They set the Viking ships on fire, routed the raiders, executed prisoners. It was a rare defeat for the Norse, but it taught them something. This land was rich, but well defended. So they turned their gaze back north. Still, the fact they even tried, that they could reach as far as Spain, it says everything about their ambition. No land was beyond the horizon. Viking law and order, the thing. For all their chaos abroad, the Vikings were surprisingly structured at home. They had no kings in the early days, no central government, but they had law, they had honor, they had the thing, a gathering, an assembly, a place where free men, not just nobles, could speak, debate, and settle disputes. Murder, theft, land disputes, all heard at the thing. It was democratic in a way Europe wouldn't rediscover for centuries. Elders acted as judges, but every voice could be heard if you were free. And the worst punishment? Outlawry. Being cast out of society. Not killed, but erased. Anyone could kill you, and no one would avenge you. The Viking world was wild, but it was not lawless. Their code was older than crowns. The role of Viking women, power behind the longhouse. Behind every saga of raiding and war, there was another world, kept alive by those who stayed behind. Viking women weren't silent spectators. They ran farms, managed estates, preserved traditions. Some even joined the fight. Burial sites reveal women laid to rest with swords and shields. Not always warriors, but not just homemakers, either. A widow could own land, divorce her husband. In Iceland, she could even speak at the thing. And the myths? They reflected this too. The Norns, who wove the fate of gods. Freya, the goddess of war and beauty, who took half the fallen warriors for herself. In a world of cold winters and constant change, Viking women weren't sheltered. They were the spine of the storm. All storms eventually burn out. By the late 11th century, the Viking Age was waning. The reasons? Complex, but unmistakable. First, kingship. The Norse world, once a patchwork of chieftains and jarls, began to centralize. Kings rose in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They needed order, taxes, roads, not raids. Power began to mean administration, not axes. Second, Christianity. The gods of Asgard fell silent. The cross replaced the hammer. From Olaf Tryggvason in Norway to Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, conversion wasn't always peaceful, but it was inevitable. With it came a different morality, different alliances. Monasteries became sacred, not targets. Raiding fellow Christians? That became heresy. And finally, Europe adapted. Fortified towns, standing armies, stronger navies. The element of surprise, once the Vikings' greatest weapon, was lost. In 1066, the Viking dream made one final grasp for power. Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, landed in England to seize the crown. He was a warrior of old, born in fire. But at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, he met his end. And with him, so too died the last great Viking invasion. From Lindisfarne to Stamford Bridge, 273 years. An age closed. The legacy of the Lindisfarne raid. Lindisfarne was more than a raid. It was a moment, a thunderclap in the dark. Before it, Europe had lived in relative peace. After it, they built castles, raised armies, and rewrote their histories. Entire kingdoms evolved because of the Norse threat. England as we know it, its borders, its monarchy, its language, was forged in fire and Viking steel. The Franks, under Charlemagne, were galvanized into action. The Rus formed in the east. Normandy was born in France. Dublin and York grew into Viking cities. But Lindisfarne also left a cultural scar. The chronicles written by monks painted the Norse as beasts, pagans, demons from the sea. They weren't just enemies, they were apocalyptic. And that stain has lasted. Yet in truth, the Vikings were more than marauders. They were traders, settlers, explorers, lawgivers, builders. Lindisfarne was not the full story. It was the prologue. The modern myth of the Viking today, we remember the Vikings in fragments. Horned helmets? Never worn. Brutal barbarians? Sometimes. But also poets, shipwrights, and astronomers. They carved sagas into stone, crossed oceans before Columbus, navigated by the stars and the sea's whisper. They had gods who laughed, loved, and bled. A mythology so rich it still fuels Marvel movies and metal bands. They were not good. They were not evil. They were human, messy, magnificent, and driven by forces still familiar: hunger, pride, curiosity, survival. Lindisfarne was where the world noticed them, but they were never defined by that alone. We look back now with awe, with fear, with wonder, because in every one of us, there is a bit of Viking, a hunger for adventure, a resistance to conformity, a fire that says, there's more beyond the sea. From the thunder of oars across the North Sea, to the cries of monks echoing across Lindisfarne's rocky shores, to the rise of kingdoms built by once outcast seafarers. This is the story of how one raid rewrote history, but this is just the beginning. The Viking world stretched from Canada to Constantinople. And if you want to follow the Longships even further into fire, frost, and forgotten legends, subscribe, share, and join our journey. We have only just begun to raid the past. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon, and never forget the island where it all began.